You're live, Mayor.
Thank you. I'd like to call to order the special City Council meeting of October the 26th, 2021. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Councilmember Nixon?
Here.
Councilmember Black?
Here.
Councilmember Curtis?
Here.
Councilmember Falcone?
Here.
Councilmember Pascal?
Here.
Deputy Mayor Arnold?
Here.
Mayor Sweet?
Here. Thank you. And hello, everybody. I guess I'm just going to turn this over to the city manager.
Okay. So thank you, Madam Mayor. So I just have a couple logistics to go over and then a few remarks, and I'm going to be turning it over to Tracy Dunlap. It's actually been almost 19 months since I've had a chance to have her sitting beside me, so it's kind of nice to share the room again, even for a short period of time. So Tracy is going to be introducing the consultant team, and she will also be coordinating all the various Kirkland staff comments and people who raise their hand from the Kirkland staff side. So she and I will be trying to coordinate if we need to make sure that you get comments, since there's a lot of people on the screen. The presentation that you're going to see is going to last about an hour, approximately. And then we scheduled to take a 15-minute break following the presentation, and then the remaining time will be available to the council for questions and answers from both the consultant team and from the staff team. And we're going to end by asking some final questions of the council about some policy direction and talk about some next steps. So, do want to remind the folks who are watching that tonight is essentially an extended study session. So while there is not public testimony tonight, there is a November 1st public community hearing that's coming up where a lot of this information will be presented, and there'll be opportunity for questions and comments at that point. Council will also be taking comments at any time in future council meetings, particularly on November 16th and on December 14th. And there'll also be opportunity to provide comments via email, phone calls, and so forth to the staff. All right, so some just brief comments. This presentation is intended to be a fairly high-level overview of the memo, the report, and the supplementary materials included in the council packet. It's not intended to be a really detailed technical presentation, although there's some technical information in it. And just a really brief reminder of how we got here. The council recognized in 2018 that the historic investment by Sound Transit and bus rapid transit on 405 and the new transit station at 85th Street would drive growth to Kirkland, ready or not. And that the best thing to do was plan for that growth. And the city of Kirkland added this to the 2019-2020 city work program. The council wanted to use this historic opportunity to create needed community benefits like affordable housing, shops, restaurants, jobs, and environmental sustainability for the station area. So in 2019, the planning staff started an EIS and planning process with low, medium, and high growth options, as well as extensive community outreach. That work was somewhat delayed in 2020 by the impact of COVID-19, but the initial results were presented to the council early in 2021. Many in the community were concerned about the potential impacts of the large-scale redevelopment. Others were excited about the community benefits that the redevelopment could bring. So in response to all this feedback, the council did two things. First, they initiated a community benefits and impact study to see if the vision could be achieved and if it could be affordable to the city. And second, the council lowered the amount of growth and redevelopment being considered at the high end. And so tonight, the council is being presented with the results of that study, followed by a question and answer session. So with that as the overview, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Deputy City Manager Tracy Dunlap. And especially with my thanks, Tracy has really been coordinating the staff team and the consultant team for the last 6 months to ensure that we get here. And she's also going to say some recognition to the staff team that really was remarkable over this past 6 months. So Tracy.
Great. Thank you and good evening. The first thing I wanted to do is introduce the consultant team, who you can see on the screen. Aaron Ishizaki is a partner with Methuen. Brad Barnett is not on the screen. I think he's having power issues, but he may be joining from Methuen as well, senior associate with Methuen. Brian Murphy, a principal with Burke Consulting. Kristen Mate, senior associate with Burke Consulting. They'll be the primary presenters during the formal presentation, and Michelle Campbell from RH2 Engineering, who did the water and sewer infrastructure analysis is on to be able to answer questions. In addition to that, we have a cast of thousands of staff representation, and we have subject matter experts from each department, and so we'll be trying to coordinate comments and getting questions from the right folks. But we also have planning and financial planning represented, who were very central to accomplishing this supplemental work. So the whole team is acknowledged, but I really wanted to call out two people in particular. One is Allison Zeich, who has been the project manager overall with this station area plan, but in this particular case, she was managing a lot of complexity and a lot of people, and sometimes in a subject matter area that's not necessarily her normal day-to-day activity, and she's been great. And Kevin Pelstring, budget analyst in financial planning, has really embraced this, and I said he may be one of those rare people who speaks both planning and finance at the same time. And so they've worked very hard to make sure that all of the pieces came together, along with the consultants and the rest of the city staff. And we hope that the overview will help you feel confident at the rigor that was done, given that this is a lot of conjecture, in that we don't know when the development will happen or exactly how, but we're trying to look at it as a whole and say, is there enough ability to afford this to be able to make it worthwhile and to achieve the community benefits? And so while, unfortunately, the one thing I'll say is it won't happen exactly like this, we hope that the whole picture gives you some confidence that there is a path if some tools are put into place and some decisions are made. And so, as the city manager indicated, we have a fairly lengthy presentation that hits the high points of all of these things, but we're hoping to move through that and answer clarifying questions perhaps during the presentation, so that we leave a lot of time in the meeting for you to ask more detailed policy questions, but also to have a policy discussion. So again, the city manager and I will coordinate if there are staff people who want to make a comment, or if there's a specific question that we'll call on, and hopefully we'll make this go quickly and we'll be able to get as much information out there as possible in the time we have. So with that, I believe that Erin is starting the presentation, and so I'll turn it over to her.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracy, and good evening to everyone. Good evening, Mayor Sweet. Good evening, Deputy Mayor Arnold, and all the council members this evening. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you to share the work that's been done. And as has been said, it truly has been a collaborative effort. So we really do appreciate all of the work amongst every single department within the city, as well as the team. So as you just heard, this is our schedule for the evening. We'll have hopefully under an hour here overview for you on the results of the study, the Fiscal Analysis and Community Benefits Study. We'll take a break and then have a good lengthy opportunity for discussion, comments, and questions from you all. So I wanted to start out with a bit of background on the station area plan, since it has been a bit of time since we got started with this study. You know, it's a unique place, the station area. It's always been at a crossroads. And of course, I also want to acknowledge it's the traditional land of the first people of Kirkland, the Duwamish people, both past and present, and to honor with gratitude the land itself as well as the Duwamish tribe. But it's always historically been a crossroads as well, from sort of the first commercial road out to Redmond, one of the first groceries on the east side historically, to some of the commercial that's there today. And as we know, the new rapid transit station at 405 and 85th will connect Kirkland regionally. It'll be frequent bus service is planned for every 10 to 15 minutes. A market study that had an outlook of 10 to 15 years showed great potential for residential development, as well as really strong location advantage for the station area. And that's in terms of office development, but also shops, services, affordable housing, and new jobs. So the vision that the city set out back in 2019, thinking about this regional investment in transit, is an idea of compact, transit-oriented growth around that new regional BRT station, as well as the trail, the Kirkland corridor trail connections that are right there. And it's a really exciting chance to grow smart, to increase access to opportunity, and to benefit both the station area and Kirkland as a whole. These points are the city's objective that was laid out at the beginning of the project, to maximize transit-oriented development and to create the most opportunity and inclusion, the most value for the city, community benefits, including affordable housing and quality of life. So as was mentioned last year, 3 alternatives were developed for study. And these were developed based on a number of efforts that have occurred over the years. They were based off of a framework of the comprehensive plan. We looked at the goals within the neighborhood plans, as well as the progress on the sustainability master plan. And all of the engagement and effort that went into each of those plans was carried forward as the basis for the initial concepts. The draft EIS, which is a supplement to the comprehensive plan, looked at 3 different growth alternatives that were studied and shared at the end of last year. And I do want to mention inclusion has been a value for this project since we started. We have been following the King County Equity Impact Review process and have had a really strong focus on expanding engagement throughout this project. It was really awesome. We heard from over 600 people who live and work, of all different ages, who live and work in Kirkland, about the draft alternatives early this year. And you can see here some of the different engagements that we had, a wide range of opportunities, from online open house to a student project with Lake Washington High School students, to working with Chinese Information Services and other organizations. We did hear overall that alternative 2, which was called Guiding Transit-Oriented Growth, had the most favorable response from everyone as a whole. We also heard some common themes and questions, and you can see the word cloud here, but definitely still some remaining questions. So we know that at that point, at the beginning of 2021, Council really did want to consider these draft alternatives further, especially around topics of infrastructure, services, and public benefits. And interestingly, what we heard as well is that some of the greatest opportunities were also some of the greatest challenges for the station area plan vision. And these topics are mobility, infrastructure, and inclusion. And so there's a couple of things that happened at that point early this year. Number 1, as was mentioned, a supplemental study was requested to study both benefits and impacts. And then we also lowered the intensity of allowed development within the options that were studied. So I'll give you, so this sort of were the key guiding questions for the analysis for that supplemental study. So if the city were to implement this vision of the station area as a thriving new walkable center with high-tech jobs, with plentiful affordable housing, with sustainable buildings, shops and restaurants, all connected with transit. Sort of 2 topics of study. The first is fiscal impact. The question, can the city afford the investments necessary to address the increased demand on both infrastructure and public services? And then on the community benefits side, the study questions were, how can the public receive the benefits of growth, and how can development advance the city's priority objectives. So this was the basis for the study. I'm going to give you the highlight takeaways from what the findings were, and then we'll walk through each of those sections. So high level, this question, is the vision feasible? What the study found as a broad takeaway is the study compared two different alternatives which were narrowed from the EIS alternatives. The study found that the city must make significant capital investment under sort of current trends, which is our study alternative A. That one does not generate much development contribution to what the required infrastructure would be. In comparison, the higher growth alternative, transit connected growth, Alt B for the study, is feasible to serve, but the city does need to recognize that there will be a variety of different strategies that will be needed to balance both budget and needs. Some interesting things within the analysis. Generally, development funded capital projects as well as capital related revenues that are anticipated to be generated in the eastern quadrants of the study area, so east of 405. They are important to funding improvements on the west side of 405, especially some multimodal improvements west of the bus rapid transit station. The second interesting piece, the majority of revenues that are generated by the commercial, the majority of revenues generated are generated by the commercial components of the eastern quadrants. And the third thing, the greatest potential for value capture that may be used for community benefit is with non-residential rather than residential development, and it increases with height. So we'll walk you through all of those in more detail, but those are some of the trends that were found through the analysis. So high level, what the study found, again, is that there may be a variety of different strategies that could be used to balance the city's budget and to serve the needs within the station area. So you can see here on the bottom a list of potential next steps should the city be interested to continue pursuing this idea of the transit connected growth alternative. Some key things in there include really looking at some of the policies, including both baseline requirements and possible policy changes to things related to infrastructure, for example, parking, and also looking at parks policies. The second is to consider developing a TIF district strategy, which is a district financing strategy to fund area-wide investments, especially things that are providing multiple benefits, things like streetscape improvements or large parks. So that would be the second next step. The third is to look for partnership opportunities of ways to achieve program alignment and coordinate with stakeholders on things like shared uses. The fourth is to develop a density bonus program. There's a couple of key areas which will be useful there to look at small open spaces, educational spaces, mobility, and sustainability. And then the final piece is a commercial linkage fee, which would help to address affordable housing and potentially workforce development. So high level, those were the findings within the study, and then we'll walk you through the various components of that. And again, we do have some key questions for council this evening that follow this presentation. These are the questions, and we'll also have a break after the presentation. But certainly, we want to build in time for Q&A within each section of this presentation. So maybe just quickly, does anyone have questions on the background materials before we go into the sections of the study? Okay, so the fiscal impacts and community benefits study is really a way to hopefully help us all set some priorities together around the station area plan. There were 3 different components within the study. The first thing that we did as a team was establish what we're calling the June alternatives. That's when it happened, which narrow the growth bookends and balance the type and mix of allowed development that's being studied. Part of that was also creating an understanding of the minimum infrastructure, representative infrastructure that would be needed for those alternatives. The second piece was 2 parts analysis, fiscal impacts analysis to test what's needed for infrastructure and services. The second part is the community benefits analysis to maximize affordable housing and access to opportunity, and also better ways to walk and bike around, to think about supporting schools, parks, and environmental benefits. And then the result of the study is a set of recommended public infrastructure as well as services investment strategies, plus community benefit strategies. So let's dive into that. And again, we're really trying to look at both practical implications and how can we work back to meeting the city's project objectives, which you can see here. Again, value for the city, thinking about sustainable service provision and fiscal responsibility. Quality of life, mobility for all ages and abilities, and parks. Opportunity inclusion, again, around affordable housing, workforce development, schools and open space, and community benefits in the form of sustainability, resilience, and health outcomes. So the first part of that study, again, was creating June alternatives and sort of developing key assumptions for the study. We were, at that point, we had our 3 EIS alternatives that have been studied. And as we said, the first action that the council directed was, let's take that highest level of growth off the table for discussion. So we began to narrow the bookends for study, and these were some of our criteria that guided us as a team. The first is to really prioritize changes that are creating real value to the community. So keep our laser focus on a transit-connected district that's maximizing that BRT investment and maximize affordable housing potential and economic development potential. The second one was recognizing that enhanced connections and lots of ways to get around are like absolutely essential to our work on this. So really additional analysis to understand how we could improve the function of Northeast 85th and begin to think about it as a more multimodal urban corridor, and to really focus in on a low stress priority bike and pedestrian network. And as well, looking at how we can help transit operate efficiently and effectively along 85th. And then the third piece, thinking about really supporting community character. This was an area we heard a lot about in the comments. So including height transitions to existing residential areas, minimizing significant changes to character outside of the major growth corridor, taking environmentally critical areas out of the growth framework, and thinking about phasing over time. So this was sort of our guideposts that we used to create the June alternatives, which you can see in these maps here. So on the right is current, what was sort of called current trends, June Alt A, and on the excuse me, that's on the left, and on the right is June Alt B, transit connected growth. So one thing to emphasize with these, you'll start to see a few maps here. We have 405 in the middle, and you can see the Cloverleaf interchange at 85th with Forbes Lake up on the right here. The white is the station area boundary. The station area plan is a 23-year planning horizon. So this is a long-term plan, and all of the growth analysis that we did to set these is looking at what would be the build out if everything that was allowed to develop did develop over the course of that 23 years. So it's sort of the most possible development is what we were analyzing. So June Alt A current trends is based on current zoning and also the draft EIS Alt 1, which is a no action alternative. It's adjusted just a little bit to reflect recent development trends because currently the market is outpacing the 2015 comprehensive plan projection. So it's quite close to existing zoning with a bit of adjustment. June Alt B is similar to the draft EIS Alt 2, but actually lowers the overall growth just a little bit from that Alt 2 and redistributes it. And the main adjustment was redistributing it from the northeast to the southeast quadrant to reflect infrastructure needs. And I'll explain that just in a minute. One other thing I wanted to mention with these growth alternatives is that we did look at a range of different potential maximum heights. And although it's not reflected in the maps and the numbers that you see, I want everyone to know that we, in developing that total growth number and also in thinking about the concepts, we are building in the idea of transitions. So we are building in the idea of transitioning with setbacks and stepbacks along the edges of these different zones. So you can see here in terms of total growth projections, June alternative A and B are in the middle of the slide here. And you can see the comparison between the total numbers of households on the top and of jobs on the bottom of this chart here, where they fit in comparison to the draft EIS alternatives. And these numbers that you're looking at are total, so inclusive of both existing households and jobs and new possible households and jobs over the course of 23 years. For the fiscal impacts analysis, part of what we needed to do as a team is to create some underlying development assumptions. And as Tracy just mentioned earlier, one thing we know is that this is a hypothetical assumption of when development might occur based on what would be allowed. And so we know that it almost certainly will be different from how it will actually occur. And we're not intending to presuppose individual property owner decisions or the actions of the private market, but we needed something as a basis to use for the study. And so you can see a timetable along the bottom of those 23 years and some assumptions about when development might occur as it was reflected in the model. A decent amount of development wouldn't occur, until several years from now as it was modeled. And these two graphs show alternative A on the left and alternative B on the right. Do want to mention, although it's not explicitly reflected in the analysis, that by virtue of just having more jobs and more households, more homes in the station area in itself, we think would be a benefit. So I mentioned earlier that we adjusted where the growth, the type and mix of growth within that June alternative B. So I want to just quickly describe that. On the left here is a traffic map. These are traffic maps of what traffic volume increases might be based on the modeling. On the left is looking at how much it would increase in volume if you go from existing conditions to the draft EIS Alt 2. So you can see this big traffic impact here and volume increase in the northeast quadrant. Although, this is, as the crow flies, close to that BRT station, it's a quite constrained area because it's right next to 405 and Forbes Lake. So it has limited ways to kind of get out and access the network. So one change that we've made, as I mentioned, was we adjusted the amount of growth from that northeast quadrant down a bit more southeast to balance it out a bit more. And that actually had quite a measurable change in the volume increase in traffic, which you can see here on the map visually, how that volume changes. So it really helped to sort of redistribute the level and mix of growth. Just want to make sure folks know that was part of the process because we heard the concern about traffic. And then the final piece of kind of the underlying assumptions within the model is there was a whole series of analyses done trying to understand what base level of infrastructure investment would be required to support the growth, the maximum possible growth within that next 23 years of the planning horizon. So these are a couple of maps mapping out all of the investments and representative infrastructure needs that are much further detailed out in appendices to the supplemental report. You can see, to me, the main difference is in June Alt B, there's, this zone on the eastern quadrant, again, kind of matching up with the intensity of growth and that commercial corridor where more infrastructure would be required. And the interesting thing is that actually, much like the rest of Kirkland and many suburban communities, in fact, the city will face financial sort of pretty significant capital investments and demands for services, even if the area just continues to develop under current trends without, making many changes to zoning at all. So Brian will share this later, but the analysis shows significant shortfalls under current trends. So in comparison, Alt B for transit-oriented growth, although more infrastructure is needed, and mostly in that red area, it's also more concentrated. So it actually allows for the city to serve it a bit more efficiency and shows less shortfall for those infrastructure needs. Here's a list of some of the top city-funded representative infrastructure projects that you'll find in that analysis and report. So just highlighting a few of them. Again, this is by department. So for example, water, one of the top city-funded projects is a water main under 405 as required by WashDOT due to the BRT station. For sewer, there's a lot of capacity-driven projects that would be needed to handle additional flows from the growth. For stormwater, a bit more minimal in terms of base infrastructure needed, which would be replacing some pipe along 120th. And for transportation, you can see has the majority of projected infrastructure needs. So here's a list of some of the top ones. We'll get into that a bit more as well. And so in each of those infrastructure reports, infrastructure was sort of costs were assigned based on current city policies as to whether they would be development funded or city funded. So all of that is the basis to get us into the fiscal impact analysis, and I'll have Brian and Kristen share that overview. But before we do that, any questions on those assumptions and basis of the study? All right. Brian and Kristen, are you ready for this portion?
We are ready. Thank you, Erin. Good evening, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor, members of council. I'm very pleased to be here this evening to present our draft findings from the fiscal analysis. And as we move into the work, I just want to emphasize that this was a joint effort by our team here at Burke and our colleagues at Echo Northwest, and I'll describe their contributions as we move forward. So on the next slide, you'll see the key question that we were asked to address here in the fiscal analysis. And essentially it is, can the city afford the investments necessary to support increased demand on public services and infrastructure in the station area? So we'll walk through some of our assumptions and some of the context that surrounds that question. We'll show you the fiscal impacts for Alt A and Alt B, and we'll discuss the capital impacts topic by topic. But the short answer, Erin's already alluded to, and that is, the answer is yes. And in fact, Alt B, or that transit-oriented growth, comes with some benefits to the city in that it brings additional revenues, it brings additional tools, it brings some development-funded infrastructure, and it actually helps address some of the demands the city would be facing in any case under existing growth conditions. So on the next slide, that point is made a little bit more generally here with some foundational context when we look at the city's fiscal future. 2 points to make here. The first is that the Washington state tax structure and limitations on property tax revenues in particular means that city revenues often don't keep up with the cost of inflation. And that's in the absence of growth. As city council members, you're very familiar with that, and you work on that gap, that structural gap, every 2 years as you balance your budget. But that will certainly be at play here in the city long term in any case. The second point I'd like to make is that the station area plan is not an opportunity to catch up on existing service deficits. So as with other cities, you have a structural gap in your revenues. You also are not funding your services as much as you would often like to, both in terms of operations and in capital. And we're not looking at the station area as an opportunity to bridge those gaps and provide enhanced levels of service, but rather the question is, can you maintain existing levels of service with growth envisioned by the station area plan? So the model that we developed on the next slide is driven by land use. So over on the left, you see that development program. For both alternatives, we identified specific projects, made assumptions, as Aaron said, about start dates, the development type, the types of development and the square footage that would occur. And that led us to project both households and employment for both alternatives. That development program fed into a revenue model that was built, owned, and operated by Echo Northwest. And that looked at the city's land base, your tax rates, your fee base, and identified both operating revenues and capital revenues that would stem from Alternative A and Alternative B. We took those revenue projections, fed them into an overall fiscal model that also compared them obviously to the costs, again, on the operating side and on the capital side. So the very same development assumptions were used by departments to assess their operating costs moving forward, and also the equipment and facilities that would be needed to provide service. When we subtract the costs from the revenues generated, we come to the city's net fiscal impact. So 2 important points here is that we're looking at city revenues and city costs primarily. We do look at the impacts on the school district, but primarily our focus here is on the city. And secondly, we are aligning revenues and costs and making sure that as we project revenues, we're applying them in ways that are allowable under state law and under city policy based on the restrictions for them. The next slide presents that high-level summary that we've alluded to. So this is showing that from a fiscal perspective, Alt B is more beneficial than Alt A. And this is driven by the fact that there's revenues that come from that more intense development. There's efficiencies, as Aaron said, to serving more concentrated growth. And there's significant development funded infrastructure under Alt B. Under both alternatives, we see the city generating a net surplus in operations, and that's shown in that top line in the chart. There is a capital deficit in both cases and under both Alternative A and Alternative B. But as shown on the bottom line there, the deficit is smaller under Alt B. And this just makes the point of the significant capital investments that Aaron has spoken about that are required under Alt A or existing growth conditions. So our focus became how can Alt B or this transit-oriented growth help make the city's position better, and how will that play out with regard to schools, parks, transportation, as well as that overall fiscal sustainability. But one more methodological point on the next slide before I pass the baton here to Kristen to speak through more of the details. When our team worked on the draft EIS, we did do staffing projections for both fire and police, and those are shown in the top 2 rows on the chart there at the bottom of the slide. And it showed significant staffing needs under both no action and Alt-2. In fact, under Alt-2, I think the staffing projections were so significant that City Council asked us to look at this foundational question of whether the city could afford to provide services under the growth that's envisioned in the station area. So the approach that had been taken under the draft EIS was really a population-based model, very simplistic projection on a per capita basis. So what we did in the supplemental study is engage with staff in each department, operating and capital department of the city, and had multiple sessions to talk with them about what service delivery would really look like based on existing capacity within their organization and based on the anticipated demands by June Alternative A and June Alternative B. And through that process, we identified, I think, greater opportunities for efficiency and creative solutions to be able to provide the same level of service to Kirkland residents, but I think a much finer point or a more nuanced analysis than was given under the draft EIS. So let me now pass the speaking role here to Kristen, and she'll speak through the details of the analysis.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and members of the council. I'm Kristen Mate. I'll be walking you through both the operating costs and revenues anticipated from growth in the station area, and then I'll be moving on to the capital costs and revenues. Next slide. This slide here is showing under Alternative A, the current growth scenario, what the operating costs and revenues might look like. So here you can see on the right side that there are enough operating revenues generated to cover operating costs. And this is true both on a cumulative basis over the entire study period, which is what's shown in the chart on the top, as well as on an annual basis, which is shown on the bottom right. And in Alternative A, this operating surplus is estimated to be about 26.8 million. Even with some large cost drivers from police, parks, and internal services. Next slide. By contrast, this is Alternative B, the transit-connected growth scenario. Here you can see there's also enough operating revenues to cover operating costs, but there's a larger cumulative operating surplus over the study period compared to Alt A. It's a surplus of 82.2 million versus the 26.8 that we saw on the previous slide. In Alternative B, this surplus happens even though there are increased costs from police, fire, and parks. Next. Great. So now we're going to switch to capital revenues and costs where we are seeing some deficits. So I'll show you this high-level picture, and then we'll walk by each service area, starting with the more straightforward capital costs and revenues, and then moving towards some of those more complex areas. So this slide shows big picture what is happening under Alt A and Alt B for capital costs and revenues. You can see on the total capital improvements line in the table that there are significant capital improvements needed in either alternative. And you heard this both from Aaron and Brian as well. In Alt A, the improvements needed are less costly, but there are also less development funded improvements and less dedicated capital revenues available to pay for them. And then under Alt B, there are more capital improvement costs, but there are also more capital revenues generated and more development funded improvements, which is what results in this smaller capital deficit in Alt B. Next, I'll go topic by topic. So these are all the different components that were rolled up into the summary that we just saw. And first is fire. So big picture for fire, the anticipated fire capital costs can be covered using both fire impact fees generated in the station area by new development, as well as a small portion of general operating surplus. I'm going to orient you to the charts here because they'll be repeated on each page. The green bars in the chart on the right show the annual surplus or deficit from the capital needs and revenues, while the blue line shows cumulatively if funds are saved each year to apply towards costs, how does the surplus deficit look? So for fire, you can see that you are remaining positive on a cumulative basis when you're using the fire impact fees and general government operating surplus to help cover those costs. The table at the bottom is just keeping a running tally of how much of the operating surplus is left after applying it to needs. Next slide. So police fleet and city facility needs. These are two items that were relatively small compared to the other capital costs. So they're shown here together. There's an anticipated 1.3 million in capital needs for police vehicles as staff are added, as well as 400,000 in city facility renovation costs as FTE are added to City Hall. But big picture, by using a small portion of the general government operating surplus, these costs can be covered. Next slide. Transportation. So in either alternative A or alternative B, the city needs to make significant transportation improvements. And you can see that kind of on the second to bottom line of the table. In Alt B, there are more capital improvements, but similar to the overall picture, there's also more dedicated revenues available and development funded improvements. I will point out on the left side of this slide, you can see some of those large city funded improvements that we talked about before. And some of these are kind of multimodal projects, while others are necessary to help with the traffic flow in the station area. Big picture though, you can see in the table on the bottom right that in Alt B, the transportation costs can be covered using both the transportation impact fees generated in the station area by new development, as well as all of the REIT 2 generated in the station area, leaving Alt B with a small surplus while Alt A has a deficit. Next slide. So for stormwater, there's only one pipe replacement cost assumed in both Alt A and Alt B, and that's because development in the station area actually helps mitigate some of the impacts to stormwater because there's on-site mitigation done by some of the larger commercial projects. After using the available stormwater facility charges that will be generated in the station area, there's still a remaining gap though to cover these costs. And one potential strategy the city could use to cover this cost would be to use the city's stormwater capital fund reserves, which is typical of for a cost of this size. Next slide. Water. So in either alternative, the city needs to make significant water capital improvements. You're starting to hear a theme here. But in Alt B, by the end of the study period, even though there's a capital surplus, there's not enough revenue generated in the early years to cover the construction costs of relocating a water main under 405. So you can see in the chart that the blue line with the cumulative dollars kind of dips down there. So one strategy to fill that gap in those early years and maintain annual surpluses would be for the city to issue a $10 million bond and cover debt payments using a combination of both the water capital facility charge revenue that's generated in the station area by new development and a portion of the water utility rate revenue that would be generated by the growth in the station area. Next slide. Sewer. So now we're getting into some of the more complex service areas here. So again, with sewer, in either alternative, the city does need to make significant improvements. Unlike some of the other services, sewer is kind of made up of a lot of really small projects that all add up to have this big cost. So even though there's more improvements in Alt B, like we heard before, there's more dedicated revenues and development funded improvements, which is why the deficit is smaller than in Alt A. So cumulatively over the study period, there will be a deficit for the city to fund, and this would happen in either alternative. We did look at Alt B, a potential strategy to cover this deficit, and that would be for the city to issue a $60 million 30-year bond and use sewer capital facility charges generated in the station area, as well as new sewer rate revenue to cover debt payments. But in order for there to be enough sewer rate revenue to cover the debt payments, there would be an additional rate increase required on the overall rate base. Because the city funded deficit is larger in Alt A, that alternative would require a larger rate increase than Alt B. Next slide. One thing to note is that there is an additional sewer project that's currently not included in the city-funded responsibilities. And this is for a large project that would cross under 405. It's currently assumed to be developer funded, and it's anticipated to be completed near or before the BRT station development. But if major redevelopment does not occur in the station area prior to that timing, the city would need to fund this improvement as well and recover the costs later through either increased connection charges or rates. And city staff is recommending a feasibility study for this project. Parks. So in alternative B, there's a fairly large capital facility needs projected. It's about $160 million, and this is based on using the added population in the station area and the current target level of service in the city. The majority of these costs are really being driven by the cost of acquiring and developing neighborhood park and community park acreage. It's about 76% of the costs are really coming from that level of service. As you can see on the chart on the right, using the park impact fees generated in the station area, as well as 100% of REIT 1 funds generated on new development would not be enough to cover this gap. There are several strategies that the city could use to address this gap, and likely a combination of them would be needed to address parks needs. So those are that the city could use some of the remaining general government operating surplus to help offset costs or as leverage for other funding mechanisms. The city could use some of the tools that will be discussed in the community benefits overview and on the next slide, or the city could rethink parks a little bit by considering non-acreage derived service levels, leveraging existing spaces, or reprioritizing investments. And Brian can talk a little bit more about some of those ideas.
Great, thanks, Kristen. I'll just expand on parks on the next slide, Erin, briefly, and then touch on schools before sort of wrapping up this fiscal section. So as Kristen noted, there is a funding gap with regard to parks. Staff have already been busy thinking differently about how best to serve the population around the station area and through both neighborhood parks and community parks. There are, of course, development funded options where there could be open space or parks provided by development. There could be the use of smaller parcels to provide more distributed neighborhood park type amenities for the population within the station area. The Cloverleaf area may present some opportunities for natural space. And then there's the opportunity to enhance existing neighborhood parks. On the community park level, similarly, there could be funding coming from, they could be included in the TIF district, or you could similarly enhance existing parks to provide greater access and amenity for the population. And it's worth noting that the station area would be a beneficiary as well to any voted parks funding measures that come before the community in our past that could help enhance park systems. On the next slide, we look at schools. We know this is of great interest to council. Because schools aren't a city service, we didn't consider the cost side But we did look at the number of students that would be generated under either alternative and at the revenues that would be generated. So as you see on the slide there, the draft EIS indicated about 150 students would be, new students would be added to the service area over the 23-year planning horizon, and 940 students under Alt B. And that's about 40 students per year over that 20-year period for Alt B. The school district would receive impact fees in the range of $25 million under Alt B. And if the capital levy is extended throughout the study period by the school district, it could generate as much as an additional $54 million. So there are revenues here that the school district would have to work with. And there may be community benefit strategies to explore as well, which might require providing school space through development under joint or shared use agreements. So that's definitely a strategy to consider. All right, our last slide here tries to summarize the fiscal impacts, and we'll pause after this and see if there's any questions. So our main theme is that the city will be required to make significant capital investment under Alt A or under current zoning. And Alt B actually is feasible to serve and in fact results in a smaller total deficit if we blend operating and capital dollars as shown in the chart on the right that we've shown you a couple times now. So it's worth stressing though that while it's feasible to serve, the city will have to take a proactive role in deploying a variety of strategies that we've talked about. Kristen noted funding strategies and potential rate increases for both sewer and water infrastructure, taking a creative look at parks about how to provide those services efficiently under existing parks, perhaps asking development to contribute to some of that, and then building in requirements that development addresses the Lake Washington School District school capacity needs. So many of these strategies can be combined with the community benefit strategies that Aaron will cover in the next section, and then we'll kind of come back and recap the combination of fiscal and community benefit strategies. But let's pause there. We've put a lot of information in front of you and see if there's any questions at this point.
Councilmember Nixon.
Thanks. Well, one question I have is if you looked at what's the risk of the city investing in a considerable amount of infrastructure with large upfront costs to support the early phases of redevelopment, and then for whatever reason, the later phases of redevelopment that were assumed don't happen, and kind of leaving the city without the capacity to service whatever bonded indebtedness was taken up front. How would we deal with that if such a thing happened?
I'll speak to that a bit, and then Kristen, if you have thoughts as well. I think, Councilmember, it's a good concern. Some of that risk is inherent in Alt A as well, with that intensity and development that's anticipated under existing growth. We did do some sensitivity analysis to see where both the demands for services and the revenues would be coming, and as Aaron spoke to earlier, a lot of that revenues would be coming from the commercial development that is largely in the northeast quadrant. And that's more in the near term with longer term infill development on the residential side and further along 85th. So in that sense, I think some of your sequencing exposes you to less of that risk.
Yep. The only other thing I would add is that the only large project that's really assumed near the beginning of the timeline currently is a water project. And then there is that other sewer project that the city is going to study as well. That's currently not assumed to be city funded. But a lot of the improvements occur later as well.
So what I'm hearing is that the phasing of the capital projects can be aligned with the redevelopment, so we don't take a huge risk by doing things up front on the assumption that future redevelopment is going to happen.
Yes, I think that's correct, with the caveat that there's a water and sewer project that need to occur kind of with the BRT
Right.
development, but otherwise, yes.
And we probably have to do that whether there's any development at all, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
And if I could just add, in any staff presentation where we would recommend an investment, we would highlight the risks, and we'd also highlight the actions that we'd propose to take. So for example, if this didn't happen, the consequence would be, rate increases of this magnitude and scale, or these projects, like I'm just going to make up the West of Market sewer project, might get deferred for 5 years because you do this project. So the council wouldn't make a decision like that without a full set of options presented by staff, but the risk is there, certainly, that you could make that investment and then not have the development happen. So development certainty is a key part of all this. How much certainty do you have that something's actually going to develop?
Thanks.
Councilmember Pascal.
Thank you. I had a couple questions. I don't know if this is the right area for it, but it kind of fits under a couple of the bullets here on the slide, and that's around the parks level of service, recommending kind of policy changes there in how we look at park needs. I guess I'm just curious that seems to be kind of an overarching kind of citywide policy that we want to consider or think about, and so I'm assuming that we're thinking about that as part of our pros update. But I just wanted to get confirmation that is that something we're kind of working into our pros plan and discussions with the park board, or is this kind of just more focused just on this area?
My understanding is the pros plan is looking at the current approach to level of service, but it will acknowledge that as the city develops, we're going to need to consider more urban type park development, which is what those options are we were looking at earlier, just because a pure acreage acquisition strategy is probably not feasible over the long haul. So I think my understanding of where they are currently is they're modeling around the current standards, but they're going to acknowledge that this is something that this discussion is something that's going to occur over a period of years and become more necessary as the city becomes more developed.
Okay. Yeah, just wanting to make sure that it's a bigger discussion than just this plan, it seems like. The other question was around the school capacity. I don't know, are we talking about schools later, or is now a good time to kind of ask about that a little bit more? I'll ask. We received a really good letter from the Lake Washington School District just like before this meeting that really outlined, how some different ways to really think about planning for schools in urban environment. I don't know if that was something you all considered in the financial analysis, but I guess my question is, was there any thought into from a financial feasibility standpoint, how development would occur here to where they would provide, a floor or a piece of land to schools? Like, how would that really work from a financial standpoint? Is that feasible? Was that explored in terms of any of this financial analysis, or is that kind of something completely different?
I think that's a good segue into the community benefit analysis discussion, because it's talked about there in that it wouldn't be our cost, but it would be something we might be able to require of development, and so how much of that might be feasible. And I think that is the main focus of the community benefits discussion. So okay. I think we can return to that maybe after we've walked through
Sounds
the
good.
information we have. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for this point? Seeing none.
All right, thanks for that segue there. So Let's move into the community benefits analysis. And again, the focus of the analysis was really to answer these two questions. How can the public receive the benefits of growth that's being considered? And how can development advance the city's priority objectives, which you can see on the left here, ranging from housing, schools, open space, mobility, and sustainability. The basis for the community benefits study was based around something called around potential value capture. And so this is based on a residual land value study of the full build out of allowed development within the 23-year horizon. So what it does is it studies whether there is and to what degree that increased development allowances that are being considered create potential for value capture to provide additional community benefits. And so it estimates sort of a snapshot in time of plan types of growth based on looking at typical development costs, based on estimating rent for new development, and also approximating values of existing property. So the term that we'll use, the residual land value or the value capture potential, would be any remainder based on available rents after subtracting the costs of creating the development, both hard and soft costs. So the residual land value analysis determined that overall there is the greatest potential for value capture for commercial development, and that, as you can see in these two charts, that there's more value capture potential in alternative B. We're finding that there's potential for tens of millions of dollars of additional value capture. Oops, I'm picking up a little background noise there. And that there's additional value capture potential in alternative B beyond alternative A that's primarily coming from non-residential development. So in these charts, the non-residential is on the right and the residential is on the left. You'll see that on the residential development, you don't see a lot of potential for value capture. It is important to note that your existing inclusionary zoning requirements for affordable housing within multifamily development is already providing a benefit that's not quantified in this analysis, but that you're already would, based on existing policies, see some affordable housing being developed through those. So the value capture analysis, we looked at this, and this was primarily done by Echo Northwest. So this was studied by type of development, so residential type and commercial types, as well as looking at the scale of development. So you can see along the bottom here from a low rise 2 to 4 stories up to a high rise, both in residential and in office. And then also looked at sort of the location within the study area, so a range of different land values as well. And so overall, what the analysis found is that there's the most potential, again, for value capture with commercial development, and that the value capture, which is shown in the blue bars in this graph, increases. You can see a pretty significant increase from within height, especially over 10 stories of commercial development. The analysis also found that mid-rise residential over here is not always feasible in every location. So were additional requirements or other costs put on development, for example, additional affordability requirements, it might result in less housing production that would be subject to the inclusionary requirements. So I just wanted to mention, if the city did want to pursue increasing existing inclusionary zoning, it would be important just to monitor that and see how policy changes might influence production. One other piece with this value capture analysis that was important to note, reducing parking ratios is really important for value capture. If parking ratios are not reduced, that's a big expense to development. And so the potential for value capture is much less in any of these types. The sensitivity is such that you can have a differential of $100 per square foot value capture difference between whether a high parking ratio or a low parking ratio is required. So this was our basis for understanding what sort of value capture might be possible from development and the types that are being considered within the station area. I also just want to briefly mention, we've talked a lot already about transportation, mobility. In addition to parking ratios, we know that mobility is one of the top challenges and opportunities for the station area. So part of the supplemental analysis did study what kinds of demand management strategies could make a measurable difference for traffic. And we also looked into what kind of complete network is possible to support people of all ages and abilities within the two alternatives. And in the supplemental study, you'll see this concept on the bottom here, which is called level of traffic stress, which is a metric that's used to describe how comfortable people are with 1 being sort of everybody, all ages, and 4 being pretty stressful conditions for almost everybody. So that was a big part of what went into the analysis. So through the community benefits, the team studied a variety of different strategies and mechanisms that might be possible to help capture and achieve some community benefits that could come along with growth. You can see the priority objectives of the city along the top here, and these are some of the top tools that we'll walk you through here that we're found to have good potential. So the first one we'll start with is called TIF, or a tax increment financing district. And it's a common tool that was recently authorized for the first time in Washington and a good opportunity for the station area. Basically how it works is it captures the future value of public investments and catalyzes growth. And how that works is the city designates an area that would benefit from an infrastructure investment. They freeze the assessed values for a time period and then may issue bonds using the increased value to service the bond debt. In Washington state, again, it's this recent legislation. You can see here some of the various guidelines, which are also detailed in the report. A few things to mention. Cities can have no more than 2 TIF areas at any one time, and there's limits to sort of what the base assessed value of those TIF areas would be, which is 200 million. And also school district portion of tax revenue is exempt. And then you can see over here, the list of TIF eligible investments is pretty broad. A lot of infrastructure related items in here. So when the team looked at the potential for TIF district strategy for the station area, we found it to be a really great opportunity. The main recommendation is to focus TIF on areas that are most likely to have significant property value increases within the station area. So places that might change more than others. We did do a preliminary estimate of potential TIF revenues based on the sort of guidelines from the legislation. And it suggests that a TIF might be able to support between 50 to 75 million in debt. When you're looking and considering projects or improvements, you really want to be looking for things that are unlikely to happen through a typical CIP, that are important to make desired development possible, and really that can provide multiple benefits. So when we looked overall within the fiscal impacts analysis we just reviewed, the 2 key opportunities we thought for TIF would include larger scale community park site acquisition and development, as well as infrastructure, and really looking for improvements that might have multiple benefits, which might include transportation, perhaps linear open space, and perhaps picking up some of those other utility needs. This is an example of Jemison Park in Portland, which was funded through a TIF and development agreement between the city and the landowner, and it has kind of a combination, good example of a multi-benefit. So it combines stormwater benefits with park and open space, and as you can see, the sidewalk and streetscape improvements. So the second strategy for community benefits is commercial linkage fees strategy. And These link new development with the increased demand for affordable housing. So the way it works is fees are charged to developers, usually on a per square foot basis, and it's typically used to fund affordable housing development. Fees are set based on what's called a nexus study. A few examples regionally and then nationally. Bothell is currently studying whether they will explore a program within their Canyon Park subarea plan. Seattle's had their linkage fee program in place for a few years now with the mandatory housing affordability program. Theirs applies just to commercial development and has different fee schedules, which range anywhere from $5 to $16 per square foot. Boston has one of the most established programs in the country, and they just kind of did an assessment and recalibrated their program. Theirs applies to commercial projects with some exemptions for smaller space, and their rate is at $15 per square foot. They also have an element which allocates a portion of the fees to workforce development programs. So there's a lot of factors that could influence revenue potential for sure. But based on that residual land value analysis and the overall revenue projections, there might be potential to generate within the range of 10 to 50 million if all of the allowed development capacity is built out within that 23-year planning horizon. So it's dependent on a lot of things, and again, especially parking ratios. And again, the most potential for value capture is within that June alternative B from non-residential development. It's important to take into consideration other requirements so that the aggregate cost doesn't make development infeasible, and also to set clear targets for housing production and other parameters. And we do think, given the housing jobs imbalance within the station area, it would be good to consider allocating a portion to workforce development. So the third, and I think this is the final strategy for community benefits that we'd recommend, is a density bonus and baseline requirement strategy. So this is establishing both base development allowances within the new zoning, and then allowing for certain zones to be eligible for an increase in exchange for providing benefits. So we're recommending a menu-based system where you could select from a menu of benefits and then provide them on a points-based system. And a couple reasons for that: it allows staff to prioritize benefits based on the need or the value to community, and it provides flexibility with applicants. So you can see it can also accommodate a range of benefit objectives like educational or community space within buildings, open space, mobility, sustainability, and affordability. The analysis did include a summary of an example baseline and bonus sort of structure and menu concepts to consider. So you can see here the range of some examples of baselines and bonuses. So giving, like, for example, schools as an example, there's baseline existing school impact fees. You might consider other things as the baseline. Bonus might be provision of on-site educational spaces or childcare, which we know is also a big need within the community. So next steps on this would be to identify kind of priorities within objectives, establishing a point system. It's important to calibrate the standards so that development is sort of held to an acceptable minimum standard of what you as a city feel is important for public benefit provision. And then as well, calibrating the bonuses so that they create a sufficient incentive along with all the other policy changes we talked about this evening. So tiers, creating these kind of tier system makes it easier for developers to participate. And you can see an example here on the right of, what might be an example of a commercial zone currently zoned at 67 feet, sort of the incremental increased base entitlement, and then potential for bonuses for more provision. So that sort of summarizes the potential for community benefits. And again, we do see a great potential for this within that, that transit-connected alternative B. So the last section is just summarizing the recommendations. I want to check in and see if there's additional questions. I know we're running a bit long here, but if there's any clarifying questions on that community benefits piece.
Councilmember Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Aaron. I've got a bunch of questions, so let's jump around. The commercial linkage fees, I understand that TIF is a finite area. Do the commercial linkage fees, do we have restrictions on how big an area we can talk? Can we talk about citywide? How does that work? I'm not clear on that.
On the linkage fee areas, I'll check in with Tracy to see who might be the best person to answer that question.
I'm not sure. I think that might be one we'll have to get back to you on. I think you define an area when you do the study, but I'm not sure that we would be restricted to these particular boundaries, and the tax increment financing is the same way. In fact, we couldn't have the whole station area boundary because it's worth more than the maximum. So I think there's probably some flexibility, but I think we'd have to get back to you on what the constraints are of how far you could go.
Okay, yeah, because I understand the constraints on the TIF, but I'm not sure on the commercial linkage. When we looked at the residual land value slide, and there's two areas, there's the residential and the commercial. Mixed use residential is retail and residential. So my question is, did we look at commercial and residential combined together? Because specifically in the South Lake Union Google campus, they're building commercial with residential on top. So I'm wondering how that would change that dynamic as far as what's more economical to build. And then my last, so go ahead and answer that if you can.
Great. So great question, and thanks for asking that for clarification. So on these different development prototypes that were modeled for the residual land value, all of the mid-rise to high-rise, both residential and office, were assuming at least one ground floor of mixed use of either retail or something else. So I don't know that the exact combination that you're mentioning or what the proportion of uses were within that particular example, but you can see for residential from 5 stories and up, and as well for office, was assuming some mixed use on the ground floor, which could be retail or could be some other examples of uses.
Okay, so it could be retail or it could be a business office with residential on top.
Correct.
Okay,
yeah.
That helps. Thank you. And then I have a question about density bonuses, but I can save it for the latter half. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Arnold.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have one question on TIF. Can you go to your next slide? You mentioned during your comments that school districts are exempt from this. Could you talk a little bit about that? The way that I read the legislation and from this means that the school districts continue to get the benefit from the increased assessed value that we're capturing. So this doing a TIF program doesn't hurt the school district. Is that a correct summary?
That's correct. We don't get that tax increment. They keep it, where we get increments from other taxing districts. We also don't get any of the part that would go to the schools. And also schools, except for sort of the early childhood side of things, are not included in the list of uses. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit, if we'd have to get creative, which I always hate to say, about shared facilities, where if we built something that the school district might use, it would have to be something we build using the tax increment financing, because schools themselves are not one of the improvements that are listed.
Got it. And then secondly, in the example mentioned on baseline requirements and density bonuses, you have an example of upping the baseline requirements along with an upzone. And I'm wondering if we have the flexibility to just set some baseline requirements without the upzone as we look at the different tiers for density bonuses.
Interesting question. So your question is, again, just to confirm, is if thinking about what base entitlements would be required within the station area, perhaps regardless of upzones, correct?
Right. Yes, I can give you an example on this. Today we already have the required affordable housing as part of multifamily development. I like the idea of the sustainability requirements on the upper tiers, but also would want to up the sustainability requirement on the base so that we know that we're getting big community benefit regardless of what tier development happens. I want to make sure we have that kind of flexibility.
Thanks for that example. Yes, that is something that other cities have done, is to create specific base requirements within a station area or a specific planning area. Agreed.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Just to follow up with that example from Deputy Mayor Arnold. So where was I going to go with this? I mean, isn't it the intention as we move away from this meeting, if we decide to move forward with, say, alternative B, that we would start researching all of this stuff and we would be looking at ways to develop policies to look more intensely at all of these combinations before we move forward?
That is, and maybe actually, Mayor, that's a great segue to our final wrap up here, if that works.
Sounds good.
All right. So we shared these pieces with you earlier again, but just to recap, the study found the city needs to make significant capital investments under current trends, which doesn't generate as much developer contribution. Transit connected growth is feasible, as Brian stated well, but will require a variety of different strategies and careful planning to meet the needs. And as we talked about, development funded capital projects as well as capital related revenues many of them are generated within the eastern quadrants that are also important to funding things happening on the western side of the study area. As we heard, majority of incremental revenues are generated by commercial components. So this set of sort of preliminary tools and strategies you just heard about, we hope would help to address infrastructure funding gaps and also to support growth and quality of life over the next 23 years within the station area. The thinking being that investment that can support today's residents can also help to catalyze some of that transit connected development and help achieve value capture for community benefits. So this is the summary of the preliminary tools and strategies to address infrastructure funding gaps over the next 23 years, which we heard about earlier. Just to recap, stormwater, looking at stormwater facility charges that can fill the gaps along with reserves. For water, consider issuing a bond, a $10 million 20-year bond. Sewer, use a combination of debt issuance and rate increases, knowing that Kristen mentioned that one project that should be studied. Preliminary tools in summary for some of the community benefit strategies for parks. There's a possibility to offset with general government surplus, but still consider a TIF strategy for community parks, especially a multi-benefit TIF project for Northeast 120th could include a linear park as well as some transportation improvements. So that should be considered. Development requirements we talked about for smaller scale open spaces and policy changes, and leveraging existing assets and looking at partnerships. For affordable housing, the commercial linkage program has great potential, especially for development, commercial development, and consider that workforce development program. Mobility, we see this as a really great opportunity for TIF strategy, especially where infrastructure needs might overlap in a multi-benefit project. And then there's lots of things around development requirements and bonuses related to parking, transit, bike share, lots of mobility choices. For sustainability, we just talked about development requirements and bonuses, and it's also a great chance to look at partnerships around other initiatives we might align with. And for schools, under either alternative, the city can help the school district solve for additional population demands, and also help support the community need for childcare and early education. So a couple things to consider there: the development requirements or bonuses. Consider policy changes actually to define retail or active frontage space to include educational or childcare spaces. Considering joint shared use agreements, as we talked about. And one piece that's a summary one here is to consider increasing allowed development capacity on public parcels that might be able to support future development of new school space. So those are kind of the wrap up again of all the pieces. And as we just discussed, next steps would include beginning to dive into these pieces of baseline bonus, of TIF, of partnerships, and commercial linkage. The final piece is just to give you an update on where we are with the stationary planning as a whole. The main thing, as Mr. Triplett shared at the beginning, we have been working on this fiscal impacts and community benefits study over the course of the last several months after the alternatives were shared last winter. As we complete this stage, we'll be coming back after we hear from you in this session with the objective to work towards defining a preferred plan direction. And so there's a couple of touch points we would anticipate in November and December, working with you all to develop a preferred direction for the plan, then moving forward next year to develop a final station area plan, along with the form-based code, comp plan amendments, and a planned action ordinance. And that is all we have. Anything else, Tracy or staff, to add before we take a break?
The only thing I would add is just on that next step slide, just a reminder that there's the November 1st public hearing that's also where similar information is going to be presented and the opportunity for public to comment. So,
thank you.
Okay, with that, should we take a break? It is 7:33. Why is it always a 3? So what does that take us to? Somebody give me a number.
7:48.
Thank you very much. See you then.
Recording stopped.
Okay, we are back in session after a brief break in our study session tonight, and I guess I'll turn it back over to the team.
Okay. So thank you, Madam Mayor. Welcome back, everybody. So our intent now is to just continue the question and comment section with the City Council. At the very end, we do have the 4 policy questions that we'll ask you, actually 3. I was asked to clarify one thing. The November 1st meeting is not a public hearing in the sense of it's a council meeting with public hearing. It's actually a community question and comment meeting. So staff and consultants will be presenting a similar presentation to what you have, and the community will be providing responses, but it's not a formal public hearing in the same way a city council meeting is. So I just want to clarify that for everybody. But with that said, we have everybody here ready, and as I said, Tracy Dunlap will be trying to watch for folks on the staff side, and everyone is here to answer any questions you might have about service levels or anything else that you heard tonight. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Okay, council, let's grill them. Seriously. Councilmember Curtis.
I don't know why I'm always willing to just put myself out there first, but here I go. I've got more comments than questions, so I'm going to go ahead and share those. Councilmember Pascal hit the nail on the head for me when I looked at this parks level of service change, in that I think it's really important that it's part of our pros plan conversation. I've been saying for quite a while that I think that we're recognizing that as we become more dense, that the intensity use of our parks is going up, and we need to address that. So I think this is a larger conversation than just the station area plan. So I don't want to carve off that change of service just for the station area plan. And as we look at this, parks is one of the most valuable assets that we have in the city. This is really important to our residents. So we need to make a very conscious effort that we're not just looking at small spaces in commercial and residential buildings, that we're fulfilling an obligation we have to the community to have complete, full, robust park space. So that's a value that we hold, and that's a value that our community holds. So we can't set that aside. On specifics, I do think it's important that developers provide on-site open space for the residents in their building. And I would like that to be part of the baseline requirement. Councilmember Falcone and I have talked over the years that we feel that there needs to be play spaces in these residential buildings for children. I also think it's really important that we have dog relief stations in these buildings so that residents aren't sending their animals out to our public parks for relief. I would like green infrastructure to be a part of our baseline, as well as sustainability issues, as Deputy Mayor mentioned. Green infrastructure, I was so happy to see it in the packet. So someone is hearing me. And I made a joke the other day that every time I say that, it's going to turn into a council drinking game. But it's in this, and let's keep talking about it. Green infrastructure is hugely important for decarbonization and expanding our canopy. And trees count for canopy growth, not just around the buildings, but on the buildings, on top of buildings. So that's really important to me. When we talk about TIF, back to my park, yes, we can look at linear parks, which I think is hugely important. Yes, I would like to look at expanding the amenities on the CKC. I've always considered the CKC a linear park. Yes, I would like to look at surplusing that WashDOT land for open space, green space. My dream would be have a linear park that connects downtown, the historical district of Kirkland, up to the station area plan. So I think that's important, but I do feel strongly that a community park is important. I like the idea of looking at Taylor Fields and what we can do there. I also like the idea of looking at any land that we can purchase moving forward. So I'm an advocate for the TIF solution. I'm almost done, guys. I think the other thing that I wanted to highlight was, one of the things that would be really helpful for me, I know that we're going to talk about transportation next, and I'll leave that to the people who are more experienced than I am. But one of the things I would really appreciate is an on-the-ground walking tour of some of these intersections. I'm a very visual, tactile person, and I need to see it to understand it. I also think it would be very helpful to compare this transit-oriented community to other transit-oriented communities that have been built, and I'm thinking of the Spring District, South Lake Union, Roosevelt, not just in what they're doing as far as transportation, but what kind of baselines did they have? What kind of models have they used? What kind of financing did they use? I would like to see it, and I would like to understand what they've, what's worked and what opportunities they've had and what hasn't worked for them. I think that will help inform us. Thank you.
Councilmember Pascal.
All right, thank you. Very good comments, Councilmember Curtis. So yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about transportation. But first, I just wanted to say just to the team that put all this together, that really recognize that was a lot of work. There was a lot of technical analysis that went in behind the scenes, and I think it really shows from the level of information that you've provided in all your reports and presentations. So thank you for doing that. I really am glad that we did this. Ultimately, I really want to be proud of the outcomes. I really want this to be that place that people want to be. And I do feel like we're on the right track. I just have a few comments on potential areas for refinement to the vision and how we get there. And so it really comes down to that, and then also the implementation strategies that you talked about today, so that I'll touch on. So apologize, but let me just kind of go through my thoughts. So on transportation, let's talk about the vision first. We have a really bold vision for jobs and housing in this area, and for transit-oriented development. I'm just wondering, though, if the transportation vision is bold enough at that same level that we have for the land use. I listened to the Transportation Commission comments and discussion over the last couple meetings when this plan has been before them, and I think they asked some really good questions, and we've also been getting some of that same questions from the public. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is really, how do people move around? I think Councilmember Curtis's idea about actually getting out there on the ground and kind of having to take a look, that'd be very insightful. But I really want to kind of bring it back down to the person level. I felt that a lot of what I read in the analysis was very vehicular centric, and that information is really important to understand. But we have some really ambitious mode share goals. So really, what does this mean for how many people are going to be biking? How many people are going to be taking transit? We don't really have those numbers readily identifiable. And I think that person trip information would be really good, not just because it would be interesting to look at, but because it really helps understand the facilities that we need to realize those, and then how those improvements need to come online over time as development occurs, and what type of development that is. And then finally, I want to be able to replicate this for other things we do in the city, because I think this is really forward-thinking stuff that we're doing. So that's kind of the vision piece. I want to talk about transit. And as one of the representatives on the King County Regional Transit Committee, I'm really pleased to see that Metro is really taking to heart the K line rapid ride, which is going to be the next rapid ride that comes online in the county. And that's something that we're writing into the policy documents that we're adopting at the county level at the end of the year, that the K line will be one of the next lines. And that's going to be really important here to connect to Stride. But how do we make that a really good bus rapid transit system along 85th Street? And I don't think we've kind of answered that just yet. We know transit will be running along 85th Street, but we also know that it's going to be really difficult for vehicles to move along 85th Street. And if transit's stuck in those that same traffic, then how does that really work? How does that really move the amount of people we're talking about moving? And the BRT along 405 is not probably going to be the prevailing transit that's going to serve this area. It's really going to be the local transit. So I really want to make sure that that works. And so that means really looking at how do we move buses up and down 85th Street. And I know that the report, if you read the report, it talks about this a little bit and says that, hey, we looked at things, but we just couldn't find anything that was feasible or cost effective. But there's not much information provided about that. I mean, what options were looked at? Why were they turned down? I really think that that's a very important discussion because we're shaping the land use here for decades to come. And if we can't do it now, we're never going to be able to do it later. So I'd like to make sure that that's fleshed out a little bit more. And so why is that important? I don't think we can realize that transit-oriented development. I don't think it will succeed if we don't have a really robust transit system. And I also want to make sure we identify those transit priority treatments now and not wish we did 5 years, 10 years later. Then the active transportation network, I thought there was a lot of additional work here that was really good. The maps in the back that showed the stress level for bicyclists and pedestrians, that was really helpful to understand. But I'm thinking that we need to up our game a little bit more on the bicycle side. I think it's not about, hey, I can't drive, so I have to ride a bus. I want to ride a bike. I mean, I said that wrong. I said, I can't drive a car, so I guess I have to ride a bike. I want to be like, no, I want to ride a bike because it's a great place to ride. Same thing can be said for transit. So I really would like to see kind of a bolder vision. What would it take to up some of those facilities, particularly along 124th Avenue, 122nd Avenue, Kirkland Way, for example, to really make them really inviting places for people and to shift that paradigm of really how we think about this. And then lastly, it's about implementation. And I was really pleased that we really dug into a lot of these things here. I fully support exploring them more. All the implementation strategies and financing mechanisms, I definitely think we're on the right track. I think one of the things that I've said this from the very beginning is I really want us to be thinking about what that phasing strategy, that threat or a threshold strategy to ensure that the timing of our investments match that pace of development. So however that works, with the financing mechanisms. And the reason why that's so important with this plan, and just for those out there that are thinking about this, why this plan is different than others in the city is this is kind of like the last bite at the apple that I see because we're considering a planned action ordinance. That basically permits the development to kind of move forward, because they know what they need to do, what they need to build, what impacts they have right now. We're setting that as the baseline. And so it's really important that we get this plan right because it's different than other plans that we've done in many ways. So those are kind of the things on my mind, kind of the 4 issues: the vision for transportation, how do we get transit to work along 85th, elevate the bicycle system, and then really kind of focus on those implementation strategies or things that I really want to see. So thanks for listening.
Great comments, Councilmember Pascal. Councilmember Falcone.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And thank you, Tracy and team, both city staff and consultants. This is a body of really good work. I feel like we, asked you to go back and answer some of these questions for us, and you did a really great job at answering them. So thank you for that. I'm going to repeat comments that I've said previously, that I think that it's really important that we're bold and creative in this plan. And I think we're there with a lot of it, but I think there's a little bit more we can do in some areas. I think in particular, we need to be bold around affordable housing, around sustainability, and around active transportation. I think we're on the right track with affordable housing and sustainability, but I agree with Councilmember Pascal that on the active transportation, I just want to learn a little bit more, and maybe it's to Councilmember Curtis's comment about, I'm also a very visual person. I think we've mentioned this before, wanting to kind of take a council field trip out there, with perhaps transportation and planning commissioners and staff to really kind of walk through and see what some of this might look like. I think that would be really helpful to do. But I feel like, kind of the values of the comments and the themes in Councilmember Curtis's comments and Councilmember Pascal's comments, I think really goes so nicely hand in hand. I really appreciated the creativity in here around both schools and parks, around urbanization of schools and around linear parks. So Councilmember Curtis, your comment about your dream of having a linear park from downtown Kirkland to this station area, I think that could so beautifully go hand in hand with active transportation and Councilmember Pascal's comments about wanting people to want to get on their bike, right? It's not just safety, which is a hugely important piece of it, but also making it pleasant and fun to bike, to otherwise roll, and to walk to and through and from this station area. I think that's really important, and I want to make sure we don't lose that aspect of it, to really make it enjoyable and to, I think, marry together the creative with the practical here to really create what we're looking for. I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think in sustainability, having some base requirements like electrification and other things just built in, I think is really, really important. I agree with Councilmember Pascal on the person trip concept. I think that there's so much of a focus on vehicular traffic through here. And I think perhaps what's missing in my mind, and maybe this is because, being a newer-ish council member joining this conversation after it was started, I'm trying to wrap my brain around how do people both outside and within the station area, how are they going to actually get to the bus rapid transit stations, right? Like, what are we doing to encourage them and make it easy for them to do it, to encourage people to use public transportation in this space? And so the more we can do of that, I think the better, to draw people in. I really, really appreciate Lake Washington School Districts being creative and thinking outside the box with urbanizing schools. I think that's really crucial. So I really appreciate their partnership and value their partnership on this. To answer the questions, generally speaking, I support the June alternative B and moving forward with planning for that. Yes to continuing to developing funding mechanisms. And I think that I've kind of touched on the community benefit strategies. I agree with Councilmember Curtis about the need for parks and play spaces and other recreation spaces for dogs. And in here, I know that we've had examples where we wanted to make sure that happened, and perhaps areas where we missed the mark on that in previous projects in our city. And I think that even more so than in other parts of the city, where where we hope to have higher proportion of affordable housing, low-income housing in here, where folks are less likely to have access to automobiles to be able to drive to other parks. We need to have as much outdoor recreation space, and indoor too, but just recreation space as possible. And whether that's through a combination of what we, bonuses or requirements for developers and or what we do as a city, I think that's so, so crucial and needs to stay a focus, not just something that we happen to do, but even more of a focus in this area around affordable housing so that folks have access to be able to easily get to parks and recreation spaces. But super well done. I'm really excited with the vision. I think that this is going to be, I'm really interested in hearing what the public has to say in the meeting on November 1st. I also listened in on the Transportation Commission meetings, and also been hearing from some community members about active transportation. So I think that's in my mind, I think the piece that could use the most work, but overall, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Falcone. Deputy Mayor Arnold.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And again, thanks to the team for a lot of information presented, not only in the presentation tonight, but as you drill into the packet, it really is an impressive body of work. Building on my previous comments, I do want to make sure that we plan for success at each tier of development so that we are satisfied with the results if things are built with existing zoning or taking advantage of any of the tools or incentives or bonuses that we provide. So I want to think through that. I totally support Councilmember Curtis's comments on parks and being creative in getting into specifics there. I would add that we should explore what opportunities there are for a playfield partnership at Lake Washington High School, given their particular footprint there. One concern I have with parks is that we are dedicating, or it was proposed dedicating the entire operating surplus to parks. And I'd like to see some options here at preserving some of that operating surplus and just to provide some cushion or buffer if we are wrong about the extra revenues generated. So would like to look at some other options for funding the parks improvements that we're talking about. On transportation, I totally support the comments that Councilmember Pascal mentioned, and this wasn't in the packet for tonight, but linked to one of the appendix when we're starting talking about the specific transportation improvement. And I would like to have a chance to really drill down on those and perhaps have an entire study session on that. I do not think we are there in the transportation improvements that need to happen as part of this plan, in particular that haven't been mentioned, or in particular, I support taking a more in-depth look at what we can do around transit priority and perhaps bat lanes where we're combining right turn lanes and transit priority lanes throughout this corridor. We are looking at a number of right turn improvements at different spots. With that, I am concerned about some of the proposals that would make crossing 85th less safe, and want to take a second look at what we're doing there and any improvements, because especially looking at 120th, that is the nearest intersection to the station itself. And when you're talking about catching your bus on the other side, we are going to need to cross 85th. I want to make sure we've got safe, inviting ways to do that. Finally, I do appreciate all the analysis on value capture. It really shows how we can take the next step in having growth pay for growth and ensuring we get the kind of development that we want by presenting incentives to do so, and am in favor of moving forward in all the options outlined around the commercial linkage fee, value capture TIF, and the bonuses structure, and look forward to future discussions about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councilmember Black.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And again, thanks to the entire team for all the hard work that was done and a wonderful presentation. I look forward to your the version of your presentation that you give to residents next Monday. And I had a long list of questions and they keep growing, but most of them, one of the things I realized is most of them have to do really with the implementation strategies, details, specifics. I like the direction we're going. Really appreciate the comments of my colleagues, particularly can't agree enough with Councilmember Pascal, but my other colleagues as well. So, you know, I really want to see as this plan really comes together, I really want to see the details of how we achieve these goals. And I would just, the reason I mentioned that I agree so vehemently with Councilmember Pascal is and I guess maybe some of my colleagues said the same thing, my other colleagues said the same thing. If there was one area where I just felt like we're not being creative enough, we're not being innovative enough, it's really in the transportation bit. Whether it's active transportation, multimodal transportation, empowering that transit experience that we need to empower in this area. I really want us to get creative. So I guess I'm just echoing and emphasizing and underscoring what my other colleagues have said. Oh, and particularly around biking and rolling. I really want to see how we're biking and rolling in and through this area and in into the BRT and out of BRT. So that's super important to me. I could say the same thing, probably parks. Parks is probably the next one where I just feel like we're going to have to get creative and innovative, and I'm not sure we're quite there yet. So I'll just add my voice to my other colleagues who said, I think, something similar. When it comes to things like schools, housing, I will say schools and housing were going into this were really some of my most acute concerns. I would say schools was my most acute concerns, was not having an impact here on schools that reduce the level of service that our families and our kids, I see Councilmember Falcone's daughter, our families and our kids expect. But I like the direction we're going. And I would say really the same thing about housing too. I have great hopes that when we really dig into the details, when we start looking at baseline requirements, things like housing affordability, green infrastructure, sustainability, those are areas where I think we're going the right direction. And I'm excited to see it. And I would like to see a significant portion of that built into the baseline requirements when we go from the hypothetical 67 to the hypothetical 85. Let's see, what else did I want to add? Oh, I did want to ask a question. Maybe the staff can look into this in connection with the discussions that I know we're actively having with the Lake Washington School District. And I really appreciated the school district's communications to us today and the work that they're undertaking. What I was curious about is one thing that's been discussed is the fact that I'm just going to use a shorthand term for it. I know there's sort of different flavors of sort of urban schools. I'm just going to use the term urban schools just as a general term. But one of the things I think we're hearing from the school district is that an urban school setting is appropriate for certain types of the mix of schools in the district, but maybe not as appropriate for other elements of the mix of schools. And one thing that's been mentioned is STEM. And I'm just curious if we've heard, or we could just ask the school district if they have an unmet need for a particular type of school, whether it's pre-K or K or STEM, which I think are the ones that are mentioned. Do they have a specific need for that in the district that they're forecasting that might be able to, where there might be a really good fit here, where there might be some land constrained locations? And then one other thing I wanted to mention, I know it came up in the discussions sort of tangentially, but we really haven't yet seen, the details around how we're going to moderate the transition from some of the taller commercial, retail, and mixed use buildings to the lower density residential. We've said it, we're hearing it a lot from the community. I know the team has heard it from us, but we're still really haven't seen that in the plans. And I just hope that we can see that fairly soon. Some of the real nuts and bolt details about how we're going to encourage development that sort of tapers, gently, for a lack of a better word, sort of gently into the lower lower density residential areas. I'm looking at my notes to see if there's anything that hasn't already been covered by my colleagues, and I don't think there is. I will say I do want to explore how TIFs work. I really want to dig in with maybe Deputy City Manager Dunlap or our Finance Director, Mr. Olson, to see if I can understand a little bit better how TIFs work, especially in a state like ours with a property tax structure like ours. I want to make sure I understand that, but that can be an offline discussion. The last thing I'll leave with is sort of, and I guess I'm inspired by what we're coming up with here. I think we're going to be able to achieve this vision. The devil's in the details. I really want to deliver on the vision that we have. And I would just, and my vision, you know, one of the things I've talked about is this vision for another new, even more vibrant Main Street for Kirkland that really ties in with the station area and the investment there, and it ties into Kirkland Urban, and it ties into Cross Kirkland Corridor, and it ties into our civic district, which is our library and our performing center and Lee Johnson Field and Peter Kirk Park, and then it ties into our historic downtown. I really hope we deliver on this. One of the things I would mention though is, you know, we're talking about the fiscal impacts on the city. We're talking about meaning costs, and we're talking about the forecasted revenue that would be generated by development in this area, and we're talking about how to secure sort of community benefits that are the benefits that we provide, meaning as a city. So we provide rolling and biking infrastructure, and we provide water and sewer, of course, the stuff that no one finds very sexy. And we enable transportation, and we cooperate with the schools. And they're also, part of my vision, I would just say, is also the intangible benefits, the non-city provided amenities. We haven't really delved into that in detail here in this analysis. That's not what this analysis is about. But I would just say, if we deliver on this vision, if we do this really well, we're going to actually see additional amenities, small businesses, shops, restaurants, third places where people are going to be able to congregate and build community. We're going to be able to deliver on that, but it's part of delivering on this whole vision. And I just wanted to emphasize that's really not what we were talking about today in this particular analysis. And with that, I'll sign off, and Mayor Sweet, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Councilmember Black. Councilmember Nixon.
Right, just before that, Madam Mayor, I think Councilmember Black raised a really good point that I want to have our planning director, Adam, speak to a little bit, which is when does these vehicles come where you start talking about things like the setbacks and design features and those sorts of things. So if we could just have him speak to that.
Please do so, Adam. That's great.
Yeah, thanks, City Manager, and thanks, Mayor. And yeah, great question, Councilmember Black. So staff has already started working on the form-based code for the project, right, which is obviously a really critical component of the whole planning effort, where we're looking at establishing building heights, uses, step downs, et cetera, probably oriented around the street framework, the street network, and the station area plan, which is going to be we'll establish sort of the guiding principles for zoning in the station area. And again, that work has already started. We've met internally with our consultant team, with staff, to sketch out some options, and we'll be bringing you some options on that, a framework for that at the very end of the year, and then a lot more detail on that starting early next year, with additional opportunities for public input as well on the specifics of the zoning code. So just wanted to mention that that work is to come, but we've already started it.
Thank you, Adam. Councilmember Nixon.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor. One of the advantages of going last is that a lot of great things have already been said, and I don't want to duplicate what my colleagues have said. I will pile on, though, and say we very much appreciate all the hard work that went into this. I think that this achieves what we hope to achieve when we set off on this direction. I'm really encouraged that it appears that it will be financially viable for the city to support the redevelopment that's envisioned. I really appreciate Kurt's comments that we will figure out how to manage the risk, even with the uncertainty of what the phasing of that redevelopment would be. I always like to have growth pay for growth, and to avoid additional financial impacts on other people in our community. I know there's limits to what we can do there. But I also recognize that there will be long-term tax revenue sustainable past the period that we're planning on, that will cover not only the cost of providing services without impacting on the service levels to the rest of the community, but that will continue to enable infrastructure improvements that we haven't already planned. And, you know, it won't be us, it'll be 2 or 3 different councils from now, but that will still be possible. I do want to acknowledge, as some others have mentioned, that we've seen a lot of great ideas from comments from members of the community, very detailed ideas in some cases. And I just want to be careful that we don't lock in too tightly to very specific things in this plan. This is a very long-term thing, and I want to make sure that we preserve flexibility, opportunities for innovation, you know, for whatever things change in the future, to be able to allow the free market to address those things and not be too prescriptive. You know, as you all know, I don't see it as my role to impose a vision. But I do want to make sure that any negative impacts are mitigated. And I think we still have work to do in that area. There, in the comments we've received already, members of the community have noted how some of the things that are even in the very high level work that's been done so far could have negative impacts. And I want to make sure that those get mitigated as much as possible. But a lot of that will happen, as was just mentioned, when we get down the road and we start looking at the specific permits, the specific development regulations. And I don't think we have to address all of those things in kind of the high level station area plan. But we have to kind of ask the community for some trust that things that are left open at the early stage will be addressed with full community input at the right time. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Nixon. In terms of my comments, oh my God, I'm just going to put a giant, I started with a giant ditto on Councilmember Curtis's comments. Then Councilmember Pascal came in and filled in a lot of blanks. Then Councilmember Falcone put a little bit of a heart on it, reminded us of a couple of the other areas. I cannot believe how well in tune this council is. And all I can say to the team is what an incredible body of work, what a compelling piece of documentation. We asked you to go out and color outside the lines, and you did. And you brought us a product, which is clearly, as Councilmember Nixon just indicated, it's going to evolve over time. But this has been an amazing body of work, and I agree, we need to move forward with this boldly. Thank you, Councilmember Falcone. City Manager.
Okay, well, thank you. On behalf of the team, thank you for all those comments. I really appreciate that. I do want to ask your indulgence to just put the slide back up. I think we have the answers to all the questions, but I just think for the purposes of the community watching and the council, if we could just put that last slide, it has the 3 policy questions, and I will just state what I think you've given us direction on, but if anyone has wants to edit my remarks, go for it. So I believe what you said is we should continue to go forward in drafting the plan direction around June Alternative B. That seems to be the consensus of the council. And continue to work on the proposed solutions for the future infrastructure projects so that you have more information by December 14th. And that to begin to refine the community benefit strategy. So bring you options to fund those studies, to look at things like commercial linkage fees and tax increment financing and so forth. So is that a good summary of where the council is? Okay, so one of the things that I will do with not a lot of time, the mid-buy budget memo is actually, I have to finish it tomorrow, but what I'm going to do is ask our finance staff to sort of quickly add up all those things, and we might have a paragraph with some monetary money in as a request for the mid-buy discussion, which is the study session on November 3rd. That's not the decision point, but we can try to highlight what we think that tally is for you, so you have a chance to see if that's something you want to approve on December 14th. So,
Sounds good. Okay, what else do you have for us?
I guess I'll just, one last call for either consultant comments or staff comments. Is there anything that was missed that people feel need to be stated? So, Tracy, if you have anything.
I think it was just marvelously well done.
Profound thanks to everyone on the consultant team and the staff team that worked on this, and thank you, Council, for giving us the direction and the resources to make this possible, because you gave us pretty clear direction back in January, February, and June, and that's really the key to the success. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all, and good evening.
Have a good night.